I never forgot that. Dick, you always seem so happy. Did you ever actually dislike anyone in Hollywood? And I always laugh because the truth is I've always been a fundamentally peaceful guy.
When Dick Van Dyke reached 101, he had already lived a life most people could only dream about. From unforgettable television roles to decades of laughter, fame, heartbreak, and second chances, his journey seemed to have revealed everything. But when he looked back, the memories that mattered most were not the awards or the applause. They were the people who stood beside him when the cameras were gone. And among them was one person whose place in his heart remained especially powerful. So, who did Dick Van Dyke love most? The revelation of a Hollywood legend. Dick Van Dyke has lived more than a century, giving him a rare chance to look back on his extraordinary journey with fresh eyes. He achieved almost everything an entertainer could dream of: Broadway success, television fame, unforgettable films, major awards, and generations of devoted fans. Yet after so many years, fame can begin to feel different. The applause fades, the trophies grow quiet, and the memories that matter most are often connected to the people who shared the journey. Eventually, the applause grows quiet, and the awards that once seemed so important become reminders of another time. Movies turn into cherished memories, while famous performances become stories from the past. When that happens, fame begins to matter less. The deeper question becomes, who stayed close, shared the difficult moments, and remained when the cameras finally stopped rolling? For Dick, that question goes far beyond The Dick Van Dyke Show, Mary Poppins, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and the performances that made him beloved by generations. When he looks back now, the biggest memories are not simply about the roles he played or the applause he received, but the people who shared those moments with him. There was Margie Willett, the woman who knew Dick long before Hollywood transformed his life. She stood beside him through uncertain beginnings, difficult moments, and dreams that had not yet become reality. Then came his children, who knew a very different side of him. To them, Dick was never the television legend millions applauded. He was simply their father, the man they knew at home. There was also Mary Tyler Moore, his legendary co-star and one of his closest friends. What began as an unforgettable television partnership slowly developed into a genuine friendship built on laughter, trust, and mutual respect. Even after the cameras stopped rolling, their connection remained strong, becoming one of the most meaningful relationships Dick carried with him throughout his remarkable life. And then, much later, came Arlene Silver. Their relationship surprised many people because of their 46-year age difference, which quickly became the focus of public attention. But Dick saw something far more personal. Arlene brought companionship, laughter, comfort, and a renewed sense of happiness into his later years. As he approached his 100th birthday in 2025, he spoke openly about their bond, explaining why their connection remained strong despite the doubts and questions surrounding it. That makes his story far more personal than a simple look back at an extraordinary Hollywood career. Throughout Dick Van Dyke's life, there were many people who became part of his journey. But did he forget those who started the journey of life with him, or those who joined him later? Or does everyone still hold a place in his heart? Let's uncover the astonishing details. The woman who knew Dick before the world did. Before millions knew his name or recognized his face, there was Margie Willett. She knew him as a young man with dreams, uncertainty, and little fame, standing at the beginning of a journey that would eventually transform his life. Their story began before the fame, before the major television roles, and long before Hollywood turned Dick into a household name. They married in 1948, when his career was still taking shape, and together they eventually welcomed 4 children: Christian, Barry, Stacy, and Carrie Beth. Those early years looked nothing like the glamorous Hollywood life people would later associate with Dick Van Dyke. There were bills to pay, a family to raise, and a career that was still uncertain. Dick was working to establish himself, while Margie became part of the foundation supporting their growing family. Then, everything changed. As Dick's career began to soar, the opportunities became bigger, but so did the demands. Television, theater, rehearsals, travel, long hours, and constant public attention started taking more of his time. The simple life he once shared with his family gradually changed, as success brought pressures they never expected. While Dick was building a career that would eventually make him famous around the world, Margie was raising their children and managing the realities of family life. Behind the success audiences saw on screen was a home life that required sacrifice, patience, and adjustment. That makes Margie's place in Dick's story far more meaningful than simply calling her his first wife. She knew him before fame gave him an identity. She knew the young man who was struggling, dreaming, and uncertain about his future. Before the cameras, applause, and recognition, Margie saw Dick simply as the man trying to make something of his life. Their marriage eventually came to an end after years of living increasingly separate lives, and they officially divorced in 1984. Margie died in 2007, closing another chapter of Dick's past. Yet even though their marriage ended, the years they shared, the family they built, and the memories they created could never simply disappear. The years they shared did more than create a family. They shaped Dick's early life and became part of his story before fame changed everything around him. And after more than a century of living, those early memories can carry a different kind of meaning, reminding him of who he was before the world knew his name. Because sometimes, the person who mattered most during the beginning of a journey is not necessarily the person who remains at the end. Though Margie Willett, who was Dick's first love, stopped being part of his story after their divorce, her impact at home and in raising their children is still cherished by Dick. But what place did the children who connected them hold in Dick's heart? Let's dive into the details. The people who knew Dick, simply as Dad. If Hollywood remembers Dick Van Dyke as the comedian who could make millions laugh, his children knew a very different man. To them, he was simply Dad. They saw the person behind the fame, the successes, and the mistakes. And that simple name carried a meaning no award could ever replace. Christian, Barry, Stacy, and Carrie Beth grew up while their father's career was becoming increasingly successful. They watched his television appearances, movie roles, stage performances, travel, and the growing attention that followed him everywhere. To the rest of the world, Dick Van Dyke was becoming a star. To his children, he was still the person who came home at the end of the day. But growing up with a famous father also meant experiencing the less glamorous side of that success. There were times when Dick's work kept him away from home. There were birthdays, school events, family occasions, and ordinary moments that passed while he was busy building the career that would eventually make him famous around the world. As Dick grew older, he became more honest about the parts of his life he wished he had handled differently. He realized that balancing a demanding entertainment career with being the father he wanted to be was never easy. Fame brought opportunities, but it also created moments he could not get back, making those regrets more meaningful with age. Yet, the relationship with his children did not disappear. Time gave those relationships a deeper meaning. His children gave Dick something that fame could never provide: the chance to continue growing as a person. They reminded him that love inside a family is not measured by perfection. It is built through patience, forgiveness, honesty, and the willingness to keep showing up even after you have made mistakes. That understanding becomes especially powerful when someone has lived long enough to look back on an entire lifetime. At that point, certain words begin to carry a weight they may not have had decades earlier. But after a lifetime filled with applause, awards, television appearances, and unforgettable performances, those may be among the words that matter most. Because his children were never part of the Hollywood image. They knew the man behind it. They saw the father who sometimes got things wrong, the man who had regrets, but also the person who continued learning and trying to become better. That is why his children belong in this story for a reason much deeper than family history. They represent a kind of love that existed completely outside Hollywood, outside fame, and outside the applause. And as Dick reached the later years of his life, that may have been the kind of love he valued most. Dick's children grew up sacrificing quality time with their dad because of his career. But how much did this sacrifice by Dick's family mean to him? And what could he have done better if he had the opportunity? Let's find out. When success came with a price. The strange thing about Hollywood success is that finally getting everything you once dreamed about does not always make life easier. Sometimes success brings a new set of responsibilities, sacrifices, and regrets that nobody sees from the outside. For Dick Van Dyke, success arrived on a massive scale. His television career took off. His name became known across America, and before long, he had become one of the most respected entertainers of his generation. The laughter, the applause, and the opportunities seemed to confirm that all those years of struggle had finally paid off. But behind that remarkable success was a family life that had to adjust to a career that demanded more and more of him. As Dick's professional world expanded, so did his workload. Television productions required long hours. Theater brought rehearsals and performances. Travel kept him away from home, while public appearances and professional commitments filled the spaces between. The same career that gave Dick so much also meant that there were moments at home he simply could not get back. Dick has acknowledged that there were things he wished he had handled differently. His children were growing up while he was building his career, and there were birthdays, school events, family occasions, and ordinary moments when he could not always be there. That reveals a very different side of the man audiences knew. On television, Dick could make millions of people laugh with seemingly effortless charm. But away from the cameras, he was simply a husband and father trying to balance the demands of his family with a career that was becoming increasingly difficult to step away from. And perhaps that is one of the hardest parts of looking back on a long life. You can be grateful for the opportunities you were given while still thinking about the moments you missed, the choices you might change, and the people you wish you had more time with. Although Dick's marriage to Margie eventually ended, the family they built together remained. Their 4 children continued to be an important part of his life, carrying a bond that divorce could not erase. For Dick, that connection became a reminder that fame could never replace the love and presence of family. That is why family matters so much in understanding the deeper story of Dick Van Dyke. It shifts the question away from the usual Hollywood measure of success. What did he accomplish? Instead, it asks something far more personal. Who remained important after the applause stopped? Because decades later, when Dick looked back at his life, his children were not simply memories from another era. They were still part of the man he had become. And as the years continued to pass, that bond would carry a meaning that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Dick has acknowledged that he wished he could have handled his family life differently. But what relationship existed between him and his on-screen family? And how deeply was he fond of her? Now, let's explore the friendship that outlasted television. More than Dick's television wife. To millions of viewers, Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore will always be remembered as Rob and Laura Petrie, the unforgettable couple at the heart of the Dick Van Dyke Show. Their chemistry made the series special, but behind those characters was a friendship that eventually became far more meaningful than anything audiences saw on screen. When the show began, both performers were stepping into roles that would change their careers forever. Their timing was almost effortless. A simple conversation, a small misunderstanding, or an ordinary moment at home could suddenly become hilarious because of the way they played off one another. But what made their connection special was not simply that they worked well together. They trusted each other. Mary Tyler Moore was an exceptional performer, and Dick recognized her talent early. She had remarkable timing, confidence, and a natural ability to make even the smallest moment memorable. Rather than competing for attention, the two actors brought out the best in one another. Over time, that professional respect grew into a genuine friendship that continued beyond the studio. And that distinction matters when looking at Dick's life through the question of love. Their relationship was not primarily romantic. It was something different. It was built on affection, trust, laughter, admiration, and decades of understanding one another. Mary knew the pressures of Dick's professional world, because she lived inside that world too. At the same time, she knew the person behind the performer. Dick had romantic relationships. He had children. He had a family life that followed a completely different path. Mary represented something else. She was the friend who could understand what it meant to live under the spotlight, deal with the demands of television, and remain human behind the public image. Their friendship survived long after the Dick Van Dyke Show ended. They watched each other move through different stages of life, celebrated successes, shared memories, and remained connected as the years passed. Then, in 2017, Mary Tyler Moore died.
You remember her, the iconic TV actress starred in the Dick Van Dyke Show in the 1960s. Mary Tyler Moore has passed away at the age of 80.
For Dick, losing Mary meant saying goodbye to someone who had shared a deeply important part of his life for decades. She was not just a familiar face from television, but a trusted friend who understood his humor, his career, and the person behind the famous entertainer in ways few others ever could. But the memories never disappeared, and perhaps that is what makes their friendship so meaningful to Dick's story. Sometimes, the people who leave the deepest marks on our lives are not the ones we marry, but the ones who understand us, challenge us, support us, and remain part of our hearts. Sometimes, they are the people who make you laugh, challenge you, understand you, and make you a better version of yourself simply by being there. Beyond Mary Tyler Moore, sharing an on-screen romance with Dick, and their relationship being so convincing that it could be mistaken for a real one, which real relationship was documented for Dick, and what made people doubt whether it would work? Let's uncover the details. The love that arrived so late. By the time Arlene Silver entered Dick Van Dyke's life, he was already far beyond the point most people would consider the height of a career. He was not a young actor waiting for Hollywood to notice him. He was not searching for someone to help him become successful. He had already spent decades experiencing fame, heartbreak, family changes, professional triumphs, and the lessons that come with growing older. Then he met Arlene. The two first crossed paths at the 2006 Screen Actors Guild Awards, where Arlene was working as a makeup artist. Their connection developed gradually rather than becoming an instant Hollywood romance. After Dick's longtime partner, Michelle Triola, died in 2009, Arlene became an increasingly important source of companionship and support in his life. Eventually, their relationship grew into something much deeper. They married in 2012, but almost immediately, the public seemed to focus on one detail above everything else: their age difference. Arlene was 46 years younger than Dick, and that number quickly became impossible to escape. Headlines questioned the relationship. Some people wondered whether it could last, while others struggled to understand how two people born in completely different generations could build a genuine life together. But Dick and Arlene did not allow those outside opinions to determine their relationship. They continued living their lives. They laughed together. They spent quiet time together. They shared everyday experiences that rarely made headlines. And as the years passed, something became increasingly clear. This was not simply a brief relationship that attracted attention because of an unusual age gap. By 2025, as Dick approached his 100th birthday, he was still speaking warmly about Arlene and the happiness she had brought him. By then, the attention surrounding their age difference had largely faded, while their relationship had continued quietly, showing that their connection meant far more than the headlines suggested. Arlene did not meet Dick when he was a struggling young performer trying to make his name. She did not meet him when he was becoming a television sensation or when Hollywood was opening every door. She met him after almost an entire lifetime had already passed. By then, he had already lived through incredible successes and painful disappointments, experiences that changed him deeply and shaped the man he eventually became. And somehow, just when Dick seemed to have experienced nearly everything life could offer, Arlene entered his world and changed his perspective. She showed him that growing older did not mean the end of happiness, laughter, or new memories. Sometimes, life can still surprise you with something beautiful when you least expect it. Not another career, not another award, just someone to share the next chapter with. Arlene Silver became part of Dick's life in 2012, and they've been together ever since. But is the relationship one-sided, Or do they both have genuine affection for one another? And how did they look out for each other and support one another when it mattered most? Let's find out. The life Dick actually lives with Arlene. While outsiders focused heavily on the 46-year age difference, Dick seemed to see something completely different. He spoke more about the happiness, companionship, laughter, and support Arlene brought into his everyday life, making their relationship feel less about age and more about genuine connection. He has often spoken about how naturally he and Arlene connect, despite coming from completely different generations. Arlene has expressed the same feeling, making it clear that their relationship goes beyond the attention surrounding their age difference. At its heart, it is built on genuine care, affection, companionship, and a deep understanding of each other. And perhaps the most interesting part is how ordinary their life together often seemed. There were public appearances, special events, videos, and charitable activities, but those were only the visible moments. Away from cameras and headlines, their relationship was shaped by simple conversations, shared laughter, quiet routines, and the everyday companionship that made their bond feel real. A morning together, a conversation, a laugh, a walk, just having someone beside you. That ordinary side of their relationship becomes especially meaningful when you consider how Dick's priorities changed as he grew older. After a lifetime of performing for millions, the spectacular moments seemed to matter less than the quiet ones. Fame could fill an auditorium, but it could not replace companionship at home. In 2025, Dick offered another glimpse into the simple routine he shared with Arlene. According to Yahoo, he said he aimed to go to the gym with her 3 times a week. It may sound like an ordinary habit, but that was precisely what made their relationship interesting.
He was a legendary dancer. He still exercises 3 times a week, and he just shared a video of himself doing these leg presses.
Their connection seemed to grow through everyday moments, shared routines, companionship, and genuine affection. Then came the milestone almost nobody could have imagined when they first met. Dick turned 100 in December 2025. For the occasion, Arlene helped organize a special celebration at their Malibu home, surrounded by family and close friends. The gathering even featured a surprise dance performance, making Dick's milestone birthday feel warm and deeply personal. Beyond the cameras and attention, it was a simple celebration shared with the people who mattered most to him. And that detail says a lot. After more than a century of life, Dick was not marking the moment under bright Hollywood lights or surrounded by unfamiliar faces. Instead, he celebrated at home, surrounded by family, friends, and people who truly mattered to him, with Arlene right beside him, sharing a milestone few ever reach. So the question becomes harder to ignore. When the cameras disappear, the awards become memories, and the world stops applauding. Who is the person you still want standing beside you? For Dick Van Dyke, that answer was becoming increasingly clear. Van Dyke has described Arlene as someone who brought happiness, companionship, and support into his life. But could this late-life relationship really have become the most important love of them all? Or could others still hold a special place in his heart? Let's dive into the details. Those that mattered when the applause faded. By the time Dick Van Dyke reached 101, he had already achieved more than most entertainers could ever imagine. His career was complete, leaving little more for him to prove. He had conquered Broadway, become one of television's most beloved stars, and created unforgettable moments in films like Mary Poppins and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. His career reached across generations. Yet, remarkably, Dick continued performing long after many of the people who shared his early Hollywood journey were gone, making his longevity truly extraordinary. The enormous scale of Dick Van Dyke's career was recently highlighted in the PBS American Masters documentary, which explored his remarkable 8-decade journey. Through rare footage, personal home movies, and memories shared by colleagues and fellow entertainers, the film offered a deeper look at the man behind the legendary career. The Los Angeles Times also highlighted Dick Van Dyke's remarkable longevity, portraying him as an extraordinary entertainer whose work has remained familiar, beloved, and meaningful to audiences across several generations. But after a lifetime filled with success, something begins to change. The awards that once felt priceless become memories sitting quietly on shelves. The famous roles become stories from another era. And the applause, no matter how loud it once was, eventually fades into the past. What remains? The people. His professional achievements have already been celebrated countless times. What reveals more about the man himself is looking at the relationships that remained meaningful after the spotlight moved elsewhere. Margie was there before the fame, when Dick was still trying to build a future and establish himself. His 4 children remained an important part of his life as he grew older, giving him a relationship with a family that existed completely outside Hollywood. Mary Tyler Moore became one of the most meaningful friendships of his professional life, built on trust, admiration, laughter, and years of shared experiences. And then there was Arlene. She entered Dick's life after he had already experienced decades of fame, family, heartbreak, and change. She did not meet a young performer still chasing his dream. She met a man who had already achieved almost everything, allowing her to know Dick for who he was beyond the celebrity. That makes Dick's later reflections especially revealing. After living long enough to experience nearly everything a remarkable career could offer, the meaning of success begins to change. The question is no longer simply about what he achieved, how famous he became, or how many people applauded, but about what truly mattered to him. It becomes who they loved, who they trusted, who stayed, and who made the ordinary days worth remembering. And after all those relationships, Dick's answer becomes far more personal than anyone might expect. Dick's professional success was impressive, yet it is not as important as the people who became part of his journey. But what gives one person an edge over the others? And can we conclude that she is the person most beloved to him? Let's uncover the complicated details. The person Dick chose to keep beside him. Dick Van Dyke has spoken fondly about the people who shaped his life, but each relationship meant something different to him. Some shared his earliest struggles. Others gave him family, friendship, or companionship. Understanding what each person brought into his life makes his eventual answer far more personal, revealing, and meaningful. Margie was there at the very beginning, long before Dick Van Dyke became a household name. She knew him as a young man still trying to find his place and build a future. Together, they faced the uncertain early years, raised a family, and watched his career slowly take off. She witnessed the transformation from a struggling performer into one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars. His children represented something even deeper and more lasting. Their bond with him continued through every stage of his life, reminding Dick that fatherhood was never simply another role. It was a lifelong responsibility, built on love, understanding, forgiveness, and a connection that remained long after the spotlight faded. Then there was Mary Tyler Moore, whose place in Dick's life was completely different. Their bond grew from friendship, trust, laughter, admiration, and deep professional respect. Even after the Dick Van Dyke Show ended, their connection remained strong. They continued sharing memories, supporting one another, and treasuring a friendship that lasted for decades beyond television. But Arlene became something different. She entered Dick's life when he was already in his 80s. By then, he had achieved almost everything an entertainer could dream of. He had already experienced the greatest highs of fame, along with heartbreak, disappointment, family changes, and decades of life in the public eye. Arlene entered Dick's life when his fame was already firmly established, and his greatest career achievements were behind him. She did not watch him struggle toward success or help build his Hollywood career. Instead, she met the man behind the famous name, accepted him for who he was, and chose to share a meaningful new chapter of life with him. That makes their relationship especially meaningful. When Dick turned 100, Arlene remained beside him, sharing his everyday life, and proving their connection was still strong, present, and deeply important. In March 2026, Yahoo reported that Dick Van Dyke and Arlene were celebrating 14 years of marriage. Even after all those years, Dick continued speaking warmly about their relationship, showing that their connection remained meaningful and strong despite the attention surrounding their age difference. So, if the question is, who Dick Van Dyke loved most, the answer may not simply depend on who shared the longest history with him. It could come down to who remained by his side after so much had changed. And when you look at it that way, the answer seems to point directly toward Arlene. So, what do you think about Dick's story? Is it difficult for him to choose the person he loved the most? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.